So I think we're going to actually just start. Why not, right? My name is Aaron Pilhofer. I am the editor of Interactive News Technology, and it's rather absurd that I'm standing up here on this stage with the three people to my left here. Anybody who's ever seen anything I've ever designed in my life would know that I have no business standing here. But yet I am here, and I am here to introduce this panel because when I was asked to put this together, frankly, I put together the panel that I myself would want to hear, and I'm glad you're all, at least somewhat in agreement with me, that the three individuals here I believe will add so much to this conference. So I'm going to be very brief. I will start left to right and introduce the people to my left in order that they'll be speaking. On the far left is Lee Byron, who is an interactive information designer for Facebook. He's a graphic artist, he's an artist, he's a Renaissance man. He is simply one of the most brilliant individuals I've ever met. He also interned at the New York Times for a brief period of time on the graphics desk, and was responsible for, I think, one of the most enduring graphics that we've ever published, which was the movie box office chart, that sort of ribbon, which is just gorgeous. Next to him is Elliot Malkin, who is a designer and information architect at the New York Times, though he hates the word information architect.
Today I'm okay with it.
Today he's okay with it, though. Okay. Yeah. He also is extraordinarily brilliant, and I am lucky to know him. He has been embedded in my team as a sort of an in-house expert on usability, user experience, design for the last, God, how long has it been? 6 months?
Almost a year.
Almost a year. And in that time, I think I've learned more than I ever thought I would about this subject. As I think you'll see, he's quite amazing. And finally, Jesse James Garrett, to my immediate left, is president and co-founder of Adaptive Path. He is an expert known worldwide as an expert in usability, design. He also is the individual who coined the term Ajax.
But I've never worked for the New York Times.
And has never worked. He's the only one in the panel who has not worked for the New York Times, though.
Yet.
So the panel that the big idea here, and what I hope we can all sort of leave this next hour with, is the idea that design itself is storytelling. And I think you'll see what I mean when you hear from these people. And that news sites in particular, I think this is a lesson that we all can learn, including my own site, that much of our content tends to be sort of placed into these sort of square boxes and tends to be a little bit plain Jane, I guess, is the word I'll use. And when you talk about usability, when you talk about information hierarchy, when you talk about leading a user through an information graphic and helping using visual cues to help them understand a story or help them understand how to navigate through an application or a website, I think you'll agree that that is very, very similar to the goal of writing a compelling headline or an engaging lead or a nut graph that tells you why this is important. So with that, I think I'm going to open this up to Lee.
Thanks, Aaron. See if I can get this to launch. So far this conference has been about how news online is different from the print world. I've heard lots of discussions about what to think about, what to change, what to focus on as we transition the industry from print to online. So what I understand the primary difference to be is attention span. The audience of a website is inherently different from that of a newspaper. Web viewers are extremely fickle with their attention. They're multitasking, listening to music, looking at dozens of websites at once, and skipping over the majority of what you want them to see. And we need to be able to capture attention. capturing attention is much more important than it ever has been in print because of this fickle attention span that you get. A catchy headline and a strong photo will only get your readers through your headline and photo. The web also brings a lot of unique possibilities to the table. One that's really exciting to me and that I sort of do as my day job is data visualization, otherwise known to the journalism world as interactive graphics. Interactive graphics are really hard to get right. There's a lot to consider when you're designing them. You need to tell a story, maintain the integrity of your information, and do this through an engaging design. And you have to do this all with very few words. When you have a graphic, it's about conveying things through shape, through color. And it's really hard to get right. The web and its fickle viewers, they change your design priorities from that of print. A good journalistic story is obviously important, but arguably more important is catching and keeping those eyeballs. You can't tell a story if nobody is paying attention. So there are right and wrong ways to do this. You don't want to distort your story, and you don't want to scare your viewer away with flashing lights. And I'm looking at the TV news industry when I say that. I want to talk about one theme that I thought is really powerful as I've been designing interactive graphics, and I think it applies to a lot of design space of journalism as a whole, and that's joy. Joy is about evoking emotion. It's about how people are attracted to things which evoke emotion, how people are attracted to things which seem like they have emotion. That's why people have pets, right? There's a lot of ways that you can evoke emotion. Graphics is just one of them. By using simple color and shape, you create these cultural significant gestalts that pull emotion. In online graphics, we can do even more than this. We can use animation and interaction, something that's completely focused on web alone. You can't do this in print. You can use this to evoke and convey emotion, and this is a really powerful thing. So as I was thinking about how to broach this topic from a broad point of view, I want to sort of introduce it through one of my favorite cartoons. Some of you may have seen this before. It's not a newbie, it's a classic.
Once upon a time, there was a sensible, straight line who was hopelessly in love with a dot. You're the beginning and the end, the hub, the core and the quintessence, he told her tenderly. But the frivolous dot wasn't a bit interested, for she only had eyes for a wild and unkempt squiggle who never seemed to have anything on his mind at all. They were everywhere together, singing and dancing and frolicking and laughing and Lord knows what else. He's so gay and free, so uninhibited and full of joy, she cried rapturously. And you're as stiff as a stick, dull, conventional and repressed, tied and trammeled, subdued, smothered and stifled, squashed, squelched and quenched.
So I think this is really engaging. It's interesting because it's animation through extreme graphical simplicity. You get anthropomorphism, you get personality, you get gender, and this is only expressed through a line and a dot. Now, I need to note that these are the same common shapes that are used in most data graphics, most visualizations on the web. And so why is this really engaging and you immediately feel a sense of emotional connection with it, yet the majority of online graphics you don't? Obviously, not all news graphics should be making love on your screen, but the same principle still applies. And I want to talk about a few themes in this direction really quickly. One is natural movement, and that's sort of what we just saw. So it's the quality of animation, which shapes appear to be real-world objects. Don't necessarily have to have anthropomorphic qualities, don't have to be humanist, but they have to feel like they exist in the real world. It's something that makes people connect to things really in an engaging way. It's more about transitioning from A to B. So one example of this is a graphic that we published last year for Olympic medals, where we show, basically it's a cartogram. A cartogram is where you abstract a map to use area to show something other than just geographic space. So in this sense, the size of each bubble shows how many Olympic medals each one of these countries won. And the way that we have the bubbles move is such to invoke sort of a natural movement. The way that they move from A to B isn't just a transition between those steps, but it's about feeling like they exist in a physical space. And because of this, people become much more engaged with it. Another one I want to talk about is behavior. Behavior is an interesting way to talk about the interactivity of an object. Behavior is sort of natural motion, but also in addition to that, it's also reactive and it's aware. It's more than just animation. It's something that you can touch and it touches you back. It's an invitation for a viewer to interact, and once they've interacted, they're hooked. You have their attention. A button alone, buttons don't have behavior, but elements of video games sort of do, and this is an interesting sort of thing to think about. Here's another graphic, it was also published last year, that showed the amount of spending candidates were doing. They have this behavior where each one of these dots, which shows the quantity of money spent on each one of these categories, yearns to get to the other side of the screen where it can connect with this deeper dive information. And people click on these things and they can move them around, and just the sense of it feeling real immediately hooks them in. And then once they're hooked in, you have their attention. And you can deliver this information, which is otherwise only so engaging. The last one I want to talk about is surprise and discovery. Well, it may be scary to have some of your story hidden, that you have to sort of delve into it to get that extra bit of story, and there's always a chance that your reviewer will miss it. There's something really interesting about discovering something that you didn't know was there. And it's something you can't get in print except for Where's Waldo, right? And there's one example of this I want to show. We did this timeline of the torch over time, how its design has changed. And it was an interesting way to sort of, pull out this interesting progression of physical form in the torch. But one thing was hidden in this, and that is if you clicked the first torch, and then you clicked the most recent torch, and then you went back and you clicked the first torch again, what would happen is it would zoom out and all the torches would light up. The number of people who found this was astoundingly small, and that's okay. But the people who did immediately told their friends and sent it to their friends, and their friends sent it to their friends. And we got all of these writings back in about how it was really clever that we added this in, and only one of their friends ever saw it, and he spread it to everybody else. And it immediately caught them in, and as a side effect, everybody read the story, and they got all this news about the torches, and more people learned about the history of the torch because of it. So these are obviously extreme examples of each one of these topics, but at the same point, it sort of brings about the importance of joy in news graphics and journalism in general. When the game is first to capture the attention of your audience, keep those eyeballs, and then secondly, to tell them a story, you have to compete and cooperate with video games, YouTube, Facebook, and other websites in order to keep your readership. Thanks.
I had no idea about those torches lighting up, so thanks, Lee. You call those Easter eggs, right?
I'm pretty sure it's the only Easter egg that's ever been in the New York Times. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You need to look further.
Are those, they're more recent maybe?
Excuse me one second while I get my computer set up to display. Should be just a moment. Okay. Okay. My name's Elliot Malkin. I work in the design and interactive news teams at the New York Times, and I'm going to talk about a very specific design question that we have at the New York Times, and I'm going to talk about a tool that we use to publish documents onto our website. And then I'm going to talk about how we bring design to bear on improving this tool. We're in the process of doing that right now. And what I'm talking about is something that was actually on the homepage as recently as 2 days ago. This is the homepage from a couple days ago. You can see David Letterman there. You might remember that incident. And over on the left, you can see that we have a link here with a little document on it. And that is called the Document Reader. And it says, emails, letters, and other documents illuminate Mr. Ensign's efforts to help his top aide who was married to his lover. So what that is a link to our document viewer. On the homepage, we're calling it Document Reader. Internally, we call it Document Viewer. I guess we have a little bit of internal inconsistency to work out. But so we're going to take a look at the Document Viewer. And the Document Viewer is a tool that we use to publish actual paper documents. You normally experience these documents on your own desktop, on your own laptops as PDFs. We actually publish these paper documents onto our website in what we call the Doc Viewer. And Aaron actually and his group concocted this tool about a year ago. Since then, I think we've published about 150 or so documents onto the website. Here you can see one from last year. It's called Hard Lessons, the Iraq Reconstruction Experience. It was put out, it was a report, a government document that was put out by the Office of the Special Inspector General. It's a pretty extensive, in-depth, 500-page report. And now, we very easily could have linked to this PDF so that readers who come to our site click on the link and then it downloads to their desktop. But we don't do that, and we don't do that for a very specific reason. We publish it on our site because we can wrap this document in a journalistic layer that we control. And that's the key. So let's take a look at this journalistic layer. Where is it? Well, if you go over to part 1, you can basically page through this document. It looks exactly the same as the PDF that you could download. Now, we just passed something that was yellow. Let's go back to that. Where was that? Oh, there it is. That is one of our journalistic annotations. That's an annotation. That's the journalistic layer right there. So this portion right here is something that was written by a New York Times reporter or editor. And this right here is the essence of Document Viewer right here, because we can overlay this journalistic layer upon these documents. Over on the right, you can see other pages within the document that have annotations. So I can click over to any of these, and you'll see that a little bit below the fold here, this part of the document is highlighted, and it has a bit of explanation as to why this portion of the document is significant. So in this way, you can move through a 500-page, a lengthy 500-page intensive government document, for example, and we will tell you what is significant about it. Now, this is all well and good. We're very excited about the Doc Viewer, but we're actually working on a version 2.0 of this Doc Viewer. And there's a number of things inside of it that we're trying to improve. So I'm going to walk you through a few of those things that we're trying to improve and actually show you a little prototype of what we have so far that probably you can ask Aaron, but it'll probably be up on the site in the next couple months. So here's one of the problems. When you get to this document, and let me refresh it to the initial view. So you get here and you're on page 1. Now if you clicked through here from our home page directly to this document, or more likely from one of our articles, they don't always make it to the home page, but very often these are published in connection with an article or a series of articles that are written either directly about this document or about the topic related to the document. If you link to this document, it's not one of the things we're trying to work on here is that it's not entirely apparent when you get to the surface level of this document, the first impression, that it has a journalistic layer. There's no annotation on this first page, so within that sort of first 10 to 15 second impression, it's not totally evident. So we'd like to work on sort of making our journalistic layer be more evident, be more visible. The other problem with these annotations that we're working on, which I'm going to show you as well, is that the annotations are sort of exist on a sort of piecemeal basis. They exist independently of one another, and they're not totally connected. And what we'd like to do is sort of allow them to be crafted into more of a sort of fluid narrative, something that's sort of a more connected journalistic layer that can sort of be read in a more narrative fashion, right? Which is different from an article. So it's still imposed on the document. It's still a layer on top of the document, but it's not. You don't have to go over to a separate article or a separate place to experience the sort of journalistic narrative of the document. And the other thing that we'd like to add, a piece of functionality that doesn't exist with this, is that we have right now the ability in DocViewer to annotate specific portions of the page. So you can highlight, this quadrant of this page and write an annotation for it, but we don't currently have the ability to do page level annotations, annotate sort of a range of pages, and we found that we need this functionality. So for example, if I go over to another document I have loaded up here, this problem leads to something like this, and this is actually a usability issue. When you get to this document here, this was a document from the Global Climate Coalition. This is a little confusing to people, we found. It says page 1 over here on the right in the table of contents. It says page 1, the documents. So that's confusing because it makes it seem like the first page of this report is titled the documents. But in fact, the editor who put this document together in our document viewer backend had to resort to using a page level annotation in order to do this. The documents is actually the editor's introduction to the document. But we didn't have a page level annotation to use. That didn't exist. So they had to use this in-page annotation. So it creates this issue. So in this next version of DocViewer, we're going to aim to solve that. So why don't I just dive right in to the prototype, which I brought along on my own personal website, but which was built with Aaron, a guy by the name of Alan McLean, Coy, also the design director at the Times, also worked with us, Coy Vin. And basically what we have so far is this. Now there's a couple improvements here. For one, you go to an annotation, and now we have previous and next buttons on our annotations. So now we can move through that journalistic layer more fluidly. Now all the annotations are connected. So I can go next, 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 and now you can just move through that journalistic layer. And as you can see, it's updating on the right as you move through those annotations. So I can back up and you can see it move through those annotations on the right. Now, here's the really cool part. If you don't want to read those annotations one at a time, you can move over to the annotation list view. And here is a full screen of every single annotation in this document in order as its own meta document. So you have portions of the actual images of portions of the document with annotations all together in one layer. And then, lastly, I wanted to show you the solution to this problem with annotating specific portions of the document when we actually want to be annotating the entire page. And the solution to that was we came up with these page-level annotations that we're inserting in between pages. So we now have this ability to insert essentially like these annotation cards in between pages of other documents. So the first one here is on page 4. So let's move down to page 4, and there it is. So now we have this ability to insert annotations in between actual document pages. So that really solved this problem with having to embed annotations on the actual page when we actually don't want to. And then lastly, and I'm just going to conclude, is, you know, what are some of the other things we're exploring maybe in version 3.0? Take a look at this Geithner document. You might remember Tim Geithner's schedule came out. When was it? Sometime early this summer or in the spring. And basically it was something like, what is that, 658 pages of schedule information. And so what we did was, because we knew it was going to be time consuming, a lot of work, and we wanted to get it up as fast as possible, we uploaded Geithner's schedule and we included share your observations. So we invited our readership to annotate this document along with us. Now, we didn't have the ability for our audience to annotate the pages actually on the document, which is something we've started thinking about for a future version. So what we had to do is use a blog page to collect comments about it in what we call an overflow, and a comment overflow. So if you click here, you can see these are all, we had 73 people add their own annotations to the document. So they were basically helping us do the reporting on this document. In the future, we're going to update this platform to allow users to actually literally select portions of the page and to submit their own annotations through our own moderation queue on our site. And so that's the doc viewer. And I guess we'll do the questions after we're all through.
This is always my favorite part of conferences, isn't it yours? My name is Jesse James Garrett. I am president and founder of a company here in San Francisco called Adaptive Path. We are a user experience firm, and for those of you who don't know what that means, basically we work on lots of different kinds of products, helping the people who make those products make them work better for the people who use them. The methods that we apply to do this kind of work, we do research, examining, observing, and analyzing the behavior and the psychology of people who use these products. We help shape product strategy, we do design work, we help implement it, and then we help coach internal teams to develop their own competencies in understanding users, how they think and how they behave. Some of the user experience work that we've done that is particularly relevant here, we've worked on lots of different kinds of products, but we've worked on major redesign initiatives for CNN.com and NPR.org, and some of the other media properties that we've worked with also include The Economist, HGTV, and Travel and Leisure magazine. If you want to know more about the world of user experience, you can read my book, The Elements of User Experience, available in finer bookstores everywhere. They told me I had 15 minutes up here, and I was trying to think about what I wanted to talk about. and I came up with 12 things that I've learned about online news in the time that, from my experience working with online news properties. Among people who do user experience work, I'm kind of unusual in that I actually have a journalism background. Most people who do user experience work come from some other kind of product design or some other kind of almost like anthropological research background. So I've always really been interested in online news as an area, and so the work that we did with CNN and NPR especially was really enriching and enlightening for me. So they told me I had about 15 minutes. I've got 12 things to share, and I've probably burned about 3 minutes already, so that gives me about 60 seconds for each of these. So here we go. Okay, first thing, know who you are. And what I mean by that is don't try to be all things to all people. Know what it is that your readers or your viewers or your audience comes to you for. When we first started working with NPR, they at the time, their web strategy was really focused around breaking news. They saw themselves as trying to compete with television networks and news wires and other kinds of organizations online. We went out and talked to NPR listeners and the users of NPR's website, and they told us that they would never come to NPR for that kind of material. What they looked to NPR for was something very, very different. It was for depth, it was for background, it was for analysis. So NPR, by focusing on their strengths, focusing on what their audience expected from them, were able to more clearly set a strategy for their web presence. Next one, and this is something that is becoming more sort of widely practiced among online news sites. Be in the web, not on the web. And what I mean by that is don't see the web as a delivery channel for your product. See your product as a part of the web itself, something that adds to and is intrinsic to the fabric of the web. The way in which news organizations are starting to engage with social media, the way in which news organizations are opening up blogs and commenting forums and things like that are ways to become more of a part of the web itself. That said, I think it's important to keep in mind that the web is not the world. A lot of organizations look at their news sites online as if this were the only source of all news that anyone is ever going to use. And what we found in the research that we did for CNN, we analyzed people's news consumption behavior across all different media. And what we found was that people turn to different media for very specific purposes in very specific contexts. So knowing the context in which people come to your site, which it varies from person to person and varies based on the situation, but understanding that your site is not going to be the only news source for people, but it's part of their larger pattern of news consumption is important. And that kind of gets to the notion of what people do with news and really optimizing the design and the strategy for your site around this. And what we found is that news consumption behavior really falls into 4 major patterns. You have people consume news in order to absorb it. They want to kind of add it to their repository of knowledge. Secondly, you have people who consume news because they want to apply it. They want to put it into practice because it's relevant in their lives or in their work. Thirdly, you have people who they consume news because they want to share it. It's a social engagement for them. It's a way of connecting with the people around them, whether that's around the water cooler or around the dinner table. And then lastly, and this is something that Lee, I think, did a wonderful job of illustrating, people consume news because it gives them pleasure, because it gives them enjoyment. And I think that enjoyment doesn't just simply take the form of making them happy, but people consume news because they have an emotional connection to it. And leveraging that emotional connection, recognizing that emotional connection in the design of your sites is vital to meeting the needs of your audience. Similarly, it's important to support different modes of engagement. Different people want different things from websites at different times. Some people will be in a really kind of rapid-fire, headline skimming kind of a mode. Other people are going to want to go deep and use something like the document viewer that Elliot showed off. And being able to have your stories scale across these modes of engagement is really important. One of the things that we did for CNN was the introduction of the story highlights box at the top of every news page for people who didn't want to read a whole story but just wanted to find out what the story was about, to provide a hook for them, provide them a reason to even bother looking at the page. And this next one is sort of related to what I was talking about being in the web and not on it, is the recognition that every page of your website is the home page of your website. So many websites are structured and designed as if the home page is going to be the master entry point that most users are going to be coming through, when in fact more and more people are coming into your website from all different directions through lots of different channels, whether they're coming from blogs or Twitter or search engines, or any variety of other kinds of sources. And so every page now has to bear the burden of informing your audience about the range of coverage that you have, the depth of coverage that you have, and again, letting them know who you are, letting them know the kind of organization you are. If you're all about local news, showing that. If you're all about investigative reporting, showing that. So this is something that I like to say when I work with organizations. I'm working right now on a major business magazine website, and they had this. They initially came to us with this strong need to really kind of beef up and expand the navigation that was used on the site. And really, I think that the way that news sites and content-oriented sites in general approach navigation really needs to be rethought, because what we see in user behavior analysis is that people rarely use global navigation elements. It's usually in a context where someone is explicitly task switching, kind of moving from one mode of interaction to another one, where they engage with these global navigation elements. Otherwise, they really don't get used very much. What gets used much more is navigation that is contextually relevant. Navigation that is focused on the subject matter or the task that the users engage in at that moment. Organizations that are able to leverage what they can tell about the user's interest based on the page that they're on, and providing navigation that's relevant to that, are the ones that are more successful in driving traffic to other parts of the site. Another piece of advice that we often give is for organizations to put the multi in multimedia, and really thinking about the diversity of ways that are available to you to tell stories, because that's really what news is all about. It's about storytelling. And there are lots of different ways that you can tell stories. It doesn't just have to be a big blob of text anymore. You can leverage photography and video and audio and pull these things together in lots of different ways, whichever ways are appropriate to get that particular story across. This one is sort of related to the issue of navigation and using headlines for navigation. Headlines should tempt, not tease. And what I mean by that is the difference between temptation and teasing is that temptation is making someone want to know what's on the other side of the link, and teasing is simply making them wonder. And so many headlines are written to make people wonder instead of actually making people want to know. Headline writing on the web is, I think, it's an art, and it's an art that is poorly understood and has not yet been mastered. And I think that there's a lot that online news organizations have to learn about crafting headlines that tempt and not tease. Think outside the blob. So many organizations, in the way that their newsrooms are set up, in the way that their content management systems are set up, in the way that their processes work, are oriented around sort of disgorging this blob of text for every story that they cover. And there's more to it than just simply taking a multimedia approach to storytelling, but by structuring your data in ways that allow people to move through it, you can reveal aspects of stories that were previously hidden. They're really leveraging the strengths of the medium in ways that television and radio and print can't compete with, by providing tools for people to navigate through data, like the data visualizations that Lee was showing off. And that gets to this point, which is that really you are not making publications. You're creating news exploration applications and really shifting your mindset to creating a tool that lets people consume and work with the news rather than simply a delivery vehicle for the news, is vital to being able to deliver an experience that is closer to what people turn to the web for, the things that they expect the web to do for them that other media don't do. Now again, this is a really kind of undiscovered territory for us, which brings me to my last point, which is try things out and throw things out. Be willing to experiment with different kinds of approaches, and build into those initiatives success and failure criteria. And if things don't meet up to those standards in terms of the feedback that you get from users or the interest that you get, throw them out and try a different approach. By constantly iterating and evolving the approach that you take, rather than falling into a few set patterns, you can continue to push the boundaries and discover the different ways that you can deliver news online and meet the needs of people who are turning to you. And thank you all very much.
So I think you can all understand why I asked these three here. We have plenty of time for questions, so please go ahead, line up. In the meantime, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question for everybody here, starting with Lee, and then maybe going down the line. You've all worked in and around newsrooms for a while, to a lesser or greater degree. You've all worked with, I'm sure, with reporters, editors. What's the one thing that we, and I include myself as an old school sort of print journalist, we think we understand about the web and in particular news websites, but we frankly have no clue about? Start with Lee and let's...
There's so many ways I could take that question. What's the one thing that you think you know but you don't?
You can answer with many if you want.
I mean, I'll have to start with social media because that's what I work in, and I don't know if it's just the editors as much as a lot of journalists as a whole. I think social media is still a beast that's yet to be fully understood by the world outside of sort of the think tanks within MySpace, Facebook, and Twitter that dream up. We come up with these brilliant ideas that we expect people to do. We make these APIs, we unleash them into the world, and then the people who we think have the most to gain from these things tend to ignore them or not use them or use them inappropriately. So I would say that appropriate leverage of social media to capture eyeballs and bring them back and create a social context around the news world is something that still needs a lot of work.
One of the things that we tend to do, and actually this is not a print versus web issue at all, is we tend to obsess over things that our users don't care about. So, for example, and I'm not talking about the content, I'm talking about structural distinctions and categorizations on the interface that we sort of tie ourselves tie ourselves up into knots over, and then you do user testing, and they don't even notice it. They scroll right past it. And you see this all the time. I mean, we will have meeting after meeting and spend hours on whether we should call something, and I'm just like pulling something out of recent memory here because this happens all the time, whether we should call something top stories or insight and analysis, right? So we're just talking about the header that goes on top of a large collection of articles. And we will have very intense debates about this. And you can go and do user testing, and you'll find that the users scroll right past whatever header we put there, and they really just don't process it, right? They just want to get to the stories. So whether we call it top stories or insight analysis doesn't have a tremendous amount of bearing upon the actual usage. So that's just one example. And web designers are just as subject to this kind of thing as people in print. So I don't think that distinction holds.
So you really are an information architect. I think that what I would say is that interactivity is not a coat of paint. And what I mean by that is that you often see these packages that go out where they've thrown an interactive thing in there because it's the web, and you should have an interactive thing in there. But the interactive element to the story doesn't deliver to the user any insight. And really, the interactive news features that I've seen that are most successful are the ones where, by interacting with it, I learn something about the story that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise because I was able to explore the space on my own, which is one reason that the document viewer is something that's really exciting to me as a news consumer, as an interactive element that delivers genuine value to me.
Okay, following up on that, the answer to this question cannot have anything to do with the sites you currently work for or have worked on. So put those out of your heads for now. Who's doing this stuff right? Maybe start this way, because I've been picking on Lee all day. So maybe start with Jesse.
That's not fair. Yeah, who's doing stuff right?
I think we have an answer.
Well, no, it's difficult because there are things that you can point to. It depends on the stuff, right?
Well,
there are things that you can point to.
Who's doing what right?
Well, let's take your answer to the last question. Who's doing interactivity the right way, and what is right about what they're doing? A particular example that you might pull from recent memory.
Okay.
We're busy navel gazing over here. You expect us to break out of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's not fair, because I think that it's difficult to. I think honestly, you guys are setting the pace for that, right? I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, people are following the lead of the New York Times on what you guys are doing with interactive elements on the site. So
that wasn't the answer that I was necessarily wanting to get.
I didn't tell you to ask the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
That check is in the mail. Elliot, who's doing this sort of stuff right? I mean, you talked about information hierarchy and not obsessing over the small things and looking for the bigger issues. Who's doing that sort of stuff right?
Okay, well, just to answer your question, who's doing stuff right? There's no answer like this enormous, large corporate entity is doing stuff right. Because even if you look at the New York Times, we do a lot of things really well, and we do a lot of things poorly, and a lot of it happens on a case-by-case basis. We have an amazing article sometimes, and sometimes not as much. Or we might have this most brilliant, amazing, award-winning interactive graphic one day, and a couple hours later, a mediocre graphic, right? So, I don't think any of these large institutions are necessarily doing everything right or everything wrong. You know, some days they just nail it, and some days they don't. And I do think that some organizations are sort of, on the whole, probably sort of getting closer to, you know, trending towards goodness. But I don't think that even those organizations do everything perfectly well, right? It's hard to be consistent. And also you're dealing with the platform, right? And platforms are imperfect and subject to constant evolution and change.
Yeah, come on, Lee, name a name.
I would also like to dodge this question. It's a terrible question because nobody is getting it right. That's my answer, is nobody's getting it right.
All right.
And the reason is because right is an indistinguishable, it's a goal that can never be obtained. Mm-hmm. The right answer is always proven wrong as soon as it's implemented and someone says, yeah, but why not this way? It's always, right is something that people should aim towards and not a destination.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to that point, I was thinking of, there are a couple of recent, in the last year, redesigns of news sites that I've liked a lot. The recent redesign of the Los Angeles Times and the redesign of MSNBC. Now those two, if you look at them, they actually have very little in common as designs. They are taking really different approaches, but each of them is taking an approach that's appropriate for the brand and the kind of content that they're trying to put out.
Question?
Thanks. I was wondering, let's say you work for a news site that might need to be convinced to, you know, invest in people or training or something to do some of the forward-thinking design strategies or usability things you're talking about. What might you say, okay, here's some proof, here's something that works, and here's some numbers to back it up, here's some metrics you can look at to say, okay, we redesigned this site, now traffic is up 1,000%. What could we take back with to sort of say, here's something that actually works, here's what makes it worth your while?
Why do I have a feeling that question is for me?
So was that a question about the extent to which metrics informs design?
I guess just any kind of indicator that, you know, you should invest in having designers look at, you know, analyze your sites to a better degree where, you know, good design is admired and should be done.
Yeah, I think that there's a great deal of emphasis on kind of raw page views as this kind of top level gross metric, and there isn't a more sort of sophisticated eye toward user behavior metrics for websites. I think that, again, this kind of, for me, kind of comes back to this thing of knowing who you are. By identifying the kind of news source that you want to be for your audience, and identifying the behavior patterns that will correspond with success there on an initiative by initiative basis, then you can measure success or failure, and then you can correlate that back to, well, we had the designers really engaged in this project, and it got us this far, and they weren't involved at all in this project, and it only went this far.
That one I would say to always continuously iterate and check your metrics as often as possible, and never stop. Yeah. You should never have to justify allocating a designer here or there in order to say this metric needs to go up, that metric needs to go up. I'm a proponent of the idea that a website is never finished, an idea is never finished, and you should always be continuously reappropriating it for what you expect your business to be like 1 year from now, 2 years from now, which is a really difficult thing to do. And it speaks a lot to what Jesse was saying earlier. Knowing who you are is a lot about knowing where you want to be, as much as it is knowing where you are right now.
Thanks.
Hi there, I'm a college professor from Penn State University. It's really easy to take a website and just turn it into a bunch of lists of, you know, sports headlines or news headlines. What can we do to make make it more of an omnivorous, just serendipitous reading experience. A way to say, hey, this is just cool, you should look at it, beyond the obvious solutions of most viewed lists or something like that. What's a design thing that we can, some examples of design things we can incorporate to make that a better viewer experience?
I think a really interesting example of this is YouTube. How many people have been linked by somebody to a YouTube video and then all of a sudden realize they just lost half an hour on youtube.com? Yeah, it's because they focus their design on serendipity, which I think is a really interesting design principle that can be applied really well to journalism as well. That when you land on something, what's interesting is contextual to what it is that you're reading. And it's contextual not only to what you're reading, but who you are as a person. That's something that's really difficult to design for, but it's definitely something that's extremely important in terms of making navigating a site feel really natural and feel serendipitous and have you always land on stuff that you're interested in.
So, I mean, we do a lot of this. We, on the New York Times, we have this thing called the moth, which is, we call it the moth. It means middle of the homepage, but we have them on the bottom of articles. It's just a series of images, and each image is associated with an article. A lot of these have nothing to do with what you're reading. It's not related content. It's unrelated content. And that people respond positively to this. And they just keep going. And we did this. We actually recently, it's been a couple years now, we recently redesigned our HTML slideshows with the dark background that you see on our site. And at the end of every slideshow, you get 10 more slideshows to choose from and they may or may not be related. And people, like you said with YouTube, in fact, we're aware of that. You can go. It's sort of like an infinite database, right? You can just go on forever. You're clicking on more and more slideshows. It never ends. So.
I don't really have much to add to that. Serendipity is a huge challenge for websites of all stripes. I think that really the context thing is so huge. Again, I think headline writing is a really good headline writing is a powerful tool for drawing people's attention in other directions. But yeah, this is it's a tough problem, for sure.
Hi, I work for the Now on PBS website, and one thing I'd really like to do, and what you were talking about, is to know our audience better and to know who we are better, and to really take a second look at that. The problem is I don't have any money. So I was wondering if you had some creative suggestions and kind of what would you do if you were in my situation where you need to, I know that there's some tools out there to help you in terms of Facebook or whatever, but what would you specifically do to understand your audience, to better help you serve your audience and understand your mission?
I actually have an idea for that, which is to ask them. So put up a blog post that says, who are you? Hey audience, who are you? Identify yourself. Tell me who you are. We want to know. And they'll start telling you. And that's basically free. You might get a massive response and have to spend a lot of time reading those, but that could tell you a lot. What's your website again?
Now on PBS. It's pbs.org/now, and we're a weekly television program, and we have a website that is a companion to the television program, and also it has independent content as well.
I mean, it's very hard to know who your audience is, especially on very large scales, because it turns out that when you want to appeal to a broad section of the population, your audience actually may be everyone. But do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. In addition to the work that we did with NPR, we've also done work with PBS and actually with CPB as well. And I don't know where you are, where your show kind of lives in the PBS universe, but what we found with the research that we did for NPR is that being an NPR listener is like an identity thing for those people. And from what I know about your program, I would guess that there's something very similar going on there. That people who turn to a news magazine on PBS instead of 2020 or whatever, that's because of something some really strong connection that they have to the brand. And I think that you can you can leverage that. You can use that to kind of draw people out in the way that Elliot was describing. The other thing that I'll say is that you have, and again, not knowing exactly where you reside in the PBS ecosystem, but to the extent that you can reach out to the member stations, they are, and I know there are some political implications to that, but they are a potentially powerful ally and resource for you in getting out there and getting in touch with your audience.
Something tells me that Facebook knows exactly who its audience is, unlike some other sites.
There definitely is benefit to integrating Facebook on your website. If you have a Facebook fan page, we can tell you exactly the demographic breakdown of the people who are interested in you. So, I mean, not to totally plug my company, but yeah, what you're after is the demographic breakdown of your audience, Facebook's not a bad way to go.
And if you don't mind asking a follow-up question, how would you talk to your audience? Would you put up a blog post, or would you put up something on Facebook and ask them what they're looking for, what they want?
I think adding elements to your links prominent on all the places in your website where it's relevant to have those is something that gives a really easy way for people to speak back to you. Mm-hmm. Just enabling those sorts of interactions will allow people to say what they want to say back at you.
I think we have time. Sorry, I think we have time for just these last two questions. If that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Your slide about providing different modes of engagement and your example from CNN in the synopsis at the top of the article page raised a question for me. The short version of the question is, what is your orientation to duplication?
I'm sorry?
What is your opinion or orientation to duplication?
What do you mean by duplication?
So in my personal experience in programming of index pages, home pages, article pages, I've come to the conclusion that some people look to some parts of the page but not to others, and that the same information can belong comfortably on the same page twice, and other people feel strongly differently. I'm wondering what your opinion is.
I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think duplication is fine. Again, every page has to meet the needs of a variety of different audiences. You can't assume, to Elliot's point, you can't assume that the user is going to be absorbing every detail of the page, and so I think duplication is perfectly fine.
Thank you.
I would say you want to avoid it.
Hello, my name is Robert Hernandez. I'm with USC Annenberg, formerly with SeattleTimes.com. My question is towards Lee. Lee, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you left the New York Times to go to Facebook. Intended or not, that has a lot of symbolism. I'm wondering if you could talk about that decision.
Ooh, wow. And I asked the tough question.
That's a very politically charged question.
He wanted to get away from Aaron. Yeah. It was Aaron's fault.
I have a lot of love for both companies. I mean, I think that's apparent by, allowing Aaron to invite me on this panel, and I continue to interact a lot with New York Times, and I love those guys. Facebook was just a concept that really excited me and intrigued me, and it was something that I had to be a part of. And that was sort of reason enough. I wanted to be a part of that, helping Facebook come to be. So that's why I did it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all, and thanks for coming.